We'll give everyone maybe like 5-10 minutes just to shuffle in, let you guys eat and stuff, and feel free to mingle and network. I'll get some business cards and put them up here if you're interested. In case anyone's new here, which a couple of you are, I'll tell you guys a little bit about XO once we get started. But feel free to grab a business card up here. We're working on it. Jump back over and read it. I guess I'll want to do, and I'll do the react. She works with well, very much to remember all of these two in your cold world. Yeah, I did.
John, do you happen to have a way for presenter notes to still work? If not, it's okay. For presenter notes for like 2 screens, if not, that's okay.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
It might. I mean, I'm on present right now, and I don't see.
It shares the same screen, so you usually have to have like an adapter for 2 screens to work or something.
I mean, I think technically you could split your screens in the settings on Zoom. Maybe try it. When you do your share, you might be able to do that.
Okay, I'll look into that. Might work.
No, we're not working together. We tried it. Most of them just do my next couple guys. I kind of show what to do, but they got a lot of modules.
Always happens. You're welcome. Yeah.
The only way I see where what are your topics
for tomorrow? We've got somebody talking about programming in virtual reality, and we've also got somebody talking about machine learning for through hiking. To optimize your route for through hiking.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, sounds great. I honestly don't really know the full breadth of it. I'm just excited to have him come out and talk about this whole stuff.
Isn't the point of hiking not to optimize your route?
Not for through hiking, because that's like cross country, like craziness. I don't know. Yeah, through hiking is a totally different animal. It's like multiple days, multiple weeks of hiking kind of thing.
Oh,
so you want that to be optimized.
Yeah.
It's not casual.
Mix it all together into virtual reality.
Virtual reality through hiking?
Never have to leave.
I think it would tell you to take your headset off every few hours.
You have a VR?
Yeah,
you have
the Vive. It's really nice. It's a lot of fun.
A buddy of mine and I, last Christmas, my wife and his girlfriend went out of town, so we bought the Vive, and it was like $900,000. We played it for like a week straight. We just it's like
it's no longer exciting.
She wouldn't let us because the catalog at the time wasn't really that full. We played got our money's worth. We were my wife wouldn't.
It's like you rented it.
Yeah, it worked out perfectly. Free to rent.
Wow,
So,
that's amazing.
and if you ever get it again, like this guy has all the gaming on his computer. So I'll give you just a couple more minutes here.
Yeah. Is this set to record?
Yes, it's actually recording right now.
Cool.
It's an error.
So really, that's what I thought you sent me a cheat sheet. Yeah, my background. Yeah, I don't have to remind you about the cheat sheet. I can say that if you want people to talk about the. I believe this whole people look at what you already have the video stuff.
All right, everybody. I think we're just going to get started. We're about 10 minutes past, so just about time. I wanted to thank everyone for coming to the September meetup. John, the organizer for this event. Just wanted to apologize if seeing a little scatterbrain or last-minute planning for this meetup. I have a valid reason. This is my new daughter, who was born about 4 weeks ago. This is Olive. Obligatory share pictures with you guys. So, tonight we have some really exciting presentations. Stuff at the bump, a couple of other kind of similar event planning and life planning applications. The Knot is mainly what we work on here, especially in Austin. So it's an end-to-end wedding planning website. We deal with every stage of the wedding planning process. We deal with vendor-to-bride communications. We deal with in between with all of that. So with us today, we have Sam. Sam is an engineer in New York for one of our for our marketplace team. He's been messing around with GraphQL, and for my own curiosity, I asked him to come and present kind of what he's been going through in the discovery process with that. And then, but first we have Joe. Joe actually runs another meetup if you're interested. North Austin
Professional Developers.
North Austin Professional Developers. It's up near, it's up 183 near 620 at Q2. So if you're interested, you can find that. Maybe I'll throw a link in our event. If anyone lives up that way, it's a great meetup to go to. They always have a lot of really interesting talks. Which is managing imposters. Joe, I'll let you take it.
There we are, starting off with a nice custom meeting. I figure out what the camera is.
Can we turn this off?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Hey, if you're remote, can you mute your microphones.
I think the sound is coming from us. Is that the Awesome Cafe?
No, because you're muted.
That's one lighting up, or is that just
I
one?
know the guy up on the upper right of this. That did as well.
Maybe I can.
I think it's quiet now. We win?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Good work, John.
I did.
Excellent work. Amazing. Okay. Hello, everybody.
Hey, John, I'm not
first
sure if you can hear me,
question
but I
first.
can't hear the presentation.
Let's work on that first.
Can you hear me now, Sam?
Okay.
Okay, so you can hear us? We're good? Remote? Yes, excellent, cool. I'm looking the wrong direction, somebody's not even behind me. Okay, turn this a little bit, as I stand over here. All right, now let's get started. Start off with a question. Do you pretend to know stuff? I'm not really expecting answers, maybe some nods. But in the workplace, in life, just in general, do you pretend to know stuff? What is life? What's a monad? Yeah, nobody really knows. Are you ever worried that you're underqualified for what you do? Even though you do your job perfectly well, sometimes in the workplace, you just feel like a fraud, like you don't belong. My name is Joe Wroten. I work at Q2. As we've mentioned, I run the Northwest Austin Professional Developers Meetup. And I really do believe that together, through talking about this, we can overcome imposter syndrome. Now, this is not easy necessarily, and what I'm talking about here is not just going to solve anything. There's no magic bullet for this, right? It takes work, and it just takes talking about it. And so we're going to talk about understanding what it is, and strategies to overcome it, and also helping others through it. Because that's one of the keys, is us all working together collaboratively to get through this. I myself am very prone to imposter syndrome. It might seem a little bit weird standing up here in front of you all, but that's the point, is we have to get past this, we have to get over it. During my first few weeks at Q2, especially the first few days, I wanted nothing more than to go out in my car, curl up in a little ball and hide. And that's not an exaggeration, that was like on my mind the first few hours of every day until I kind of got the ball rolling, and it still was pretty rough for a while. So I'm very prone to imposter syndrome. But I need to understand it so that I can know how it affects me and how it affects others. Stephen Crowley actually had a wonderful article. When I read it, I just had that wow sensation. It struck a chord with me. Just scrolling through Medium, and it was just titled, How I Overcame Imposter Syndrome. And if you don't mind, I would like to read this verbatim for you. Stephen Crowley. He works at formerly at HubSpot as a designer. How I overcame imposter syndrome. After it nagging me for 4 years, enough was enough. My first experience with imposter syndrome, the inability to internalize one's own accomplishments and persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud, was in late 2012 when, oh my God, this is fucking terrible. I'm not even a good designer. Why did I even consider writing a blog post? I'm sorry. End of article. Like, that just symbolizes exactly what this is all about. And that's very common too for people to start up blogs and then like not even submit them or publish them most of the time. This is all the same topic, right? It's thinking maybe you have the confidence a little bit, you get somewhere and then you back off. And this is obviously a joke. This is a designer from HubSpot, and he knows what he's talking about. But this is like a very real world thing that affects lots of people. So much so that the Practical Dev, they run Dev2 online, the popular blogging for developers website. They posted a hashtag DevDiscuss on Twitter. They asked a simple question. What has been your experience with imposter syndrome throughout your career? And many more. They started talking about various topics about how imposter syndrome affected them. And the stories varied, but there were some general themes that popped up about how they didn't feel like they fit in, about maybe they were the only remote worker or one of the only remote workers. Maybe they were the only woman on the development team. You really feel like you don't fit in that way. You're the only person of your ethnicity. Or it could be education related. I don't even have a bachelor's degree, somebody might say, or an associate's degree. How do I fit in when I'm not qualified? Sometimes people do have these degrees and they still don't feel qualified. Some people have had many successful jobs in a row and there's no reason to feel how they do, yet they do. This still affects people at a very core level. And it's important to talk about these things. And I encourage you all to share with one another, not right now, I'm not putting you on the spot, but to share with people when you're not feeling comfortable. Talk about this because it affects everybody in small or major ways. Or if it doesn't affect you, it probably affects somebody that you know or work with on the day-to-day. So if this affects you or anybody that you know, these are our goals that we're going to work on. We're going to rebuild our confidence. Our confidence is specific to us. It's specific as in, I'm confident in my coding ability, but maybe not my design ability. Our self-esteem, which is an internal thing. It's how we view ourselves as people. And then there's also self-image, which is an external. It's how we think others view us. And those three things combine to be how we just generally feel about ourselves and how confident we can be. We're all very important to build those out. So I'll talk about how we can do that. Ultimately, it's all about adjusting how we perceive the world around us, how we perceive just going through our everyday work. Somebody with imposter syndrome, they might have a knowledge bubble of what I know. It's this sphere of knowledge. And then we imagine this is what other people must know, obviously. All these blogs out there, all these other languages, all these tools that we have yet to master, there's things popping out left and right, new JavaScript frameworks. And we assume that everybody else knows way more than we do, and we're always just trying to catch up. That's not accurate. That's imposter syndrome. In reality, it's much more like, here's what I know, and what everybody else knows is a similar sphere, just slightly overlapping. It's a much more realistic view to have. That's how we need to perceive the world around us. Now, somebody might have heard of fake it until you make it. It's a pretty good motto, or is it? I live this. I preach this for a long while, and I've had to learn to strike that out. Doesn't matter. It's really about believing in yourself. Because if you're just always faking it, how can you ever believe in what you do? If I'm just going to work every day and pretending I know what I'm doing, that's not going to raise my self-confidence. Or it's only going to pretend to inflate that self-esteem, how other people might view me by faking it. And that's not healthy. Instead, we have to believe in our ability to do what we're going to do. You were hired for a reason. On the other side of that coin, though, there's value in feeling vulnerable. That's a tough one. Putting vulnerability out there. And it doesn't always feel good in the moment when you do that. But how do you express being vulnerable? We do that all the time, actually, in the workplace. If you've ever done peer programming, pairing up with somebody else, that is a great way as a developer to admit, I don't know. Perhaps you know. Perhaps we can find out together. That is a way for both people involved or multiple people involved to grow together, to learn and create something new. You're expressing that vulnerability. You're surpassing what could have been otherwise a severe case of imposter syndrome, getting stuck on something for all day potentially, not reaching out. It's very valuable to be able to reach out and get past these things because you're not alone in this. That's like a joke to think that you're alone. Are you the only person working with this company? I don't think so. The only person working on a project, maybe it's a side project, but you probably have some peers. And not only for exact tasks like some programming topic, but you're not alone in overcoming how you might feel, how somebody else might feel. If you know a coworker who might be experiencing some of these symptoms of imposter syndrome, you can be the person for them because then they're not alone anymore. And honestly, take things a little bit less seriously sometimes, a little less personally. It's one thing to bring passion to a project. be really excited, put your all into it. That's great. But work is work sometimes. And it's important to know when to pull back, relax, and just not worry so much. Stephanie Hilbert posted an interesting poll tweet. She asked, when you write and or submit code for review, do you feel emotionally vulnerable? Do you have this sensation in the back of your head that something you just worked on all for the last 2 hours, all day, all week, is now being judged by your coworkers and they're going to hate it if you haven't done well enough? Well, nearly half of the people that responded, 2,500 people, said yes. And 25% didn't want to give an answer, which is a bit telling in and of itself. A lot of people feeling potentially vulnerable, but they're being critiqued. And you are being critiqued, but not in a bad way. These are by your peers, not judges. You're all working together to build an application. We're all working together to build something solid. And it's important to understand how to take the critique in a positive way to grow together. And you can do this by taking pride in the little successes. The little successes are realizing, hey, I put up a pull request today. I fixed a bug. I helped out a coworker. I got unstuck because I pair program. I didn't sit there for a long time and mull over the same thing over and over again. I got past it. These are the things that we can take for granted so easily because we'll let something small like you forgot a semicolon comment in a pull request just override everything else you've accomplished that day. You can't do that. You have to take pride in little successes, and it will vastly outweigh the small negatives that aren't even really that negative. You take things a little bit less seriously. And then lastly, if you can take that fear that you might feel by putting up a pull request or similar and convert that into a driver for learning, for growing, that is incredibly powerful. So perhaps how this affects you. How can you help some others? Making people feel accepted is a really great start. Making them feel like a part of the company. A new person comes onto your team, say hi to them, welcome them, make them feel like they actually are contributing, things like that. Encouraging the confidence, self-image, self-esteem. A lot of that has to come down to the person that is trying to build that up, but they're not alone in this. Don't let them be alone in it. And just talking about imposter syndrome, it's something that's not often talked about. That's why I'm here today. So to wrap up, building confidence, self-esteem, and self-image through believing in yourself. Don't fake it until you make it. Do it. Believe in yourself. You were hired for a reason. Opening up to vulnerability, pair programming, growing together. Realizing that you're not alone in any of this, in how you feel and in your day job. And celebrating the successes. This is one of the most important things, because if you don't celebrate the things that you've done well, you're only going to focus on the small problems you run across. And stress less. Keep that passion, but don't worry so much along the way. Again, this was about Wroten. My contact information is up there. And if you want to talk about your story, hashtag discuss practical dev on Twitter, or just talk to your colleagues. Get out there, speak with one another. Some other follow-up things, if you're interested, Sally LePaves, one of my favorite people. She is an evolutionary biologist, and she has a YouTube video, and I'll send out the link to this presentation. She talked about imposter syndrome, about her perspective as a woman in science, and just how she's gone through life with that. And Jordan Peterson has a wonderful video about failing a class. Related. It's about perception. If you failed a college class, how should you grow from that experience? A really wonderful lecture by Jordan Peterson. And Cassandra Pertz had a great talk called Stop the Fanaticism in JavaScript, which lessens the idea of elitism and people not maybe worrying about like what's JavaScript framework is better than this other one. It kind of relates back to the programming side of there not just being one correct answer. And that's all I've got. Thank you very much.
Anyone have any questions for Joe? No? Thanks, Joe.
Okay, thank you.
So next up, we have Sam. If you can just relinquish control, I think Sam will be able to present. All right. Sam, whenever you're ready.
I'm trying to relinquish control. Yes.
You can do it, Joe. I, on the other hand, am pretty sure that I really don't know what I'm doing.
You're muted.
How's everyone doing? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Sweet. Thank you for coming tonight. Okay, so let me go and share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, sweet. So as John mentioned, I'm currently an engineer at Exo Group working on the not.com product. And tonight my presentation is about GraphQL and more or less a case study. So a brief synopsis of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. I'll talk a little bit about the history of GraphQL, like where does it come from, a little bit about the technology, and then talk about some of the questions and concerns that we had on the onset of fleshing out a proof of concept. Okay. Okay, so we can thank the folks over at Facebook for GraphQL, which pretty much is seeming like a pretty solid contender to REST implementations when we talk about APIs. In 2016, an RFC draft was published, and since then, it's been ported over to a pretty meaty list of languages, everything from JavaScript to PHP. And also, it's actually funny, but we're actually having a meetup here at our New York office, so let me know if it's just too loud and I can move. How is it over there?
It's good. You're good.
Okay, sweet. Okay. And then also used by a pretty impressive list of companies. Now Exo Group also being one of them. So Facebook, GitHub, Intuit. Okay. Okay, so what exactly was the problem that we were trying to solve here or at least at not.com that kind of prompted the idea that we should even look at GraphQL? But before I get into the specific problem that we were trying to solve, I want to talk about the general problem that GraphQL is attempting to solve. And in order for me to do that, if you would bear with me, but let's just be hypothetical for a second. And I'm going to talk about a hypothetical UI that we would build out using a REST API. So let's say, for example, our MVP was to go ahead and build a web page that would surface a Star Wars film and just the title. So from the perspective of REST, we can already guess that this would be at least one network call to one resource route. And a typical payload would look like this. Now, although for this particular UI, the only thing that we really care about is the actual title and nothing else. Client side, we still have to download this data, even though we don't care about it, or at least at the moment, we're not going to use it. But not too big of an issue. So now product says, let's go ahead and extend this UI. Let's also surface the list of characters that are involved in the film. Lucky enough for us, in the call to films, we have a list of those characters in the form of resource routes. So client side, whatever application, you could enumerate over this array, make however many network calls that you need to be able to get the list of those characters. And that would be a second route. And this is an example of what that payload may look like. And again here, the only thing that we care from this payload is just the name. So client side, we're downloading bits and bits and bits of data that we just don't care about, and we're actually not going to go ahead and use. And maybe for web applications, that's not too big of an issue. But once we start talking about mobile, where network is pretty awful, latency is pretty awful, then we can sort of start to think of the negative implications of this. Now, I know what some of you guys are folks are probably thinking. Sure, you could definitely go ahead and modify your actual route or API, I should say. Maybe REST isn't dogma for you. Maybe you don't mind actually exposing character-related information in your films endpoint. Maybe you could even push the additional cost for every character to the server side to reduce the amount of network calls. You could even allow your endpoints to accept fields as query params so that the clients could specify what fields they want. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. But for us, we didn't think that would be productive. We definitely didn't want to incur that technical debt. So for us, one of the main reasons why we wanted to pursue GraphQL was, well, what would happen if we could take all of our services that are related, that have like specific like data that clumped up together kind of represent a feature or a product, and wrap a thin GraphQL layer around it, expose one endpoint. So forget about like managing all these different resource routes, forget about versioning, and give the clients the power to be able to specify or at least dictate the shape of the actual responses. So that's the general problem, or that's the general solution that GraphQL is offering, which is, in a nutshell, let's limit the amount of network calls you need to make to get data, and let's also let you specify only the fields that you care about. So GraphQL is a type system which you define. And again, this basically is a definition of your data universe and your models. Secondly, it is a query language for being able to, and I have to be specific here, it isn't a language for like querying a graph database or any data store for that matter, but it's about being able to fetch data from your application. And it's also a runtime for being able to validate, execute, and also fulfill your queries. So to kind of show you a little example of what the syntax looks like. So this is an example of a GraphQL query. Pretty much it's like JSON, but it doesn't have the value or the actual colons. And this is an example of the actual response. Now, if you notice anything from this, notice the actual shape of the response pretty much maps directly to the shape of the actual query. And this kind of alludes to the kind of power that clients have in dictating the shape of their responses. So when you're making queries with GraphQL, your actual responses will always look like your actual query. And I'll actually jump into what that may look like. So let's say, for example, that how many people in the room currently, with a show of hands, develop with Node, for example? Quite a few. Okay. Does anyone also develop with Happy? By any chance? Okay, we have two. Awesome. You guys are cool. All right. So I'm sure a lot of you guys are probably familiar, regardless of what environment you develop on, I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys are maybe some of you guys are familiar with Swagger, which is like a form of self-auto documentation. GraphQL has the same kind of concept called graphical, like GraphQL, pretty neat, so which exposes data. So every GraphQL server has a pretty neat feature called introspection. So you could create a GraphQL server and it'll actually show you insight to the entire schema that defines that entire API. So being that GraphQL only has one endpoint, for terminology's sake, we can think of query types as being those endpoints. So we can introspect this API and say, okay, well, we know we can make queries here. Fantastic. What are the actual like endpoints of query types? We have film. Fantastic. What does film have? We know we have title, off sweet. We have directors. We also have actors. And we can make that query and we can get an actual response. And also to kind of allude to the amount of control that clients have. Let's say, for example, that in my response, I'd actually, maybe I don't want my response to have film. Maybe I can title it movies. Maybe inside of title, I can have name, and I can make that request, and my response is going to reflect my query, which is movies, name, directors, and actors. So that's an example of a query. Okay. So that's pretty much like the technology in a nutshell with GraphQL. And currently right now, GraphQL supports being able to query, being able to make mutations like write data, and also make subscriptions as well. So for us, some of the questions and concerns that we had on the onset was performance. So just for all things being equal, what we did basically was map one of our endpoints directly to a query type. And we wanted to take a look at what would be the CPU and memory consumption in relation to our REST endpoints. Now, we knew off the bat that there would be an uptick in CPU and memory consumption simply because there's additional parsing of the GraphQL query, which is fine, but that's very negligible. We're talking about an average of about 2 to 3% consumption increase in GraphQL. So not that big of an issue. We also noticed slower response times, on average about 2 to 3 milliseconds slower. So not that insane, nothing to really complain about, but maybe we can probably chalk that up and partly because we're kind of still new to GraphQL, so maybe we don't know all the tips and tricks and best practices of how to actually write a very performant GraphQL server. But that was some of the actual outcomes of our data. And also anyone else who might be interested in developing, or at least, developing a GraphQL server in Node, there's also an open issue with the GraphQL JS implementation where there is slower response times when having to prune documents, basically having to just exclude fields that the client doesn't want. So it is an open issue and they're currently working on it. So that was something that we also found out. But again, in terms of just CPU and response times, it's pretty awesome. And that's a small price to pay in order to kind of minimize network calls and again, minimize the amount of data that you have to download client side. So in the grand scheme of things, it probably still ends up being more performant than our RESTful implementation, at least for that endpoint. A second question that we had was versioning. So typically in GraphQL land, some of the big names like Facebook and GitHub, they don't typically version any of their APIs, typically because the reasons why you version is because maybe you have any breaking changes. But with GraphQL, if any change is additive, like a feature is added, that's not really breaking, right? Clients just may not know about it. But if you happen to no longer or deprecate a field, that's fine. GraphQL still doesn't blow up. It'll still return the same response, but it'll just be a null value. So we're still kind of trying to see where we land in that whole entire discussion. But I think at bare minimum, what we may do is go ahead and at least version our documentation, but we won't version our routes, whether it's through the actual URL or through the actual headers. But that's still open for discussion. And lastly was for caching. So as we all know, caching you could typically do on network, client, or application. For GraphQL, since it's only one endpoint, it's never changing, you don't really have a unique snowflake. It only does 2 out of the 3. So networking, caching isn't a thing that GraphQL can do. And out of the 2 that it can do, client and application, it really does one of them well. But for GraphQL, it recommends that you probably want to go ahead and do the caching mainly on the client side. Facebook has also released a product called Data Loader for client-side application. Server-side applications. So that's something that we may look into as well. For our more complicated routes. So I guess the verdict, right, just to kind of circle back to that initial question that we asked is, well, is GraphQL a viable product for us, or a viable technology to sort of kind of come into the fold? Without a doubt, absolutely, 100%. So I think moving forward, what we want to go ahead and do is take some of our more complicated routes and port them over to GraphQL. I know earlier today we had some meetings about that, and it's probably looking like we're going to minimize our footprints with the REST, if not fully deprecated. But yeah, that's pretty much our kind of experience with GraphQL.
Thanks, Dan. Does anyone have any questions? I have one question. So the ability to customize what you're getting back, say on the client side, is there any way to alter or like flatten the schema that you get back from the API itself?
Flatten the schema from like the client side?
Yeah.
Like if you have like a deeply nested object?
Yes.
No, not really. At best, what you can do is just really, because like with the data types, you have to define them all the way down to a scalar type. So you can't really exclude what it actually traverses down to. You can only exclude the actual fields.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Anyone else? Cool. All right. Thank you, Sam.
Awesome. I'm also, and a shameless plug, but since we develop with Happy here at XO Group, we deal a lot with like Joli schemas, and and I should note as well, one of the most tedious parts of developing it on GraphQL was having to kind of define all of the actual.
You might have lost him.
Yeah.
Can we assume that he was going to say it was validating?
Models.
Yeah.
Projects.
Oh, you're there. I thought your computer died.
No, I got a charger.
So you left off, the last thing we heard was the most painful
part.
Yeah,
the most tedious part was having to go back and define all of the actual data types. It does take some upfront time to actually do that. But luckily for us at XO, we have like centralized modules that represent all of our response contracts. So it would be pretty neat if we could already take that already written schema and convert them to a GraphQL type. So we do have projects that we're going to open source where it'll make that pretty much easy and seamless. So for anyone who's already developing in Happy or developing with Joli to make their schemas, we do at some point want to go ahead and open source that and make that public to the community. Because I know for us, like it'll cut so many hours in engineering time just having to build those types. So we hope to make that available to you guys as well.
Cool. Anything else?
That's it.
Questions? Last minute questions? Awesome.
No
Thanks
problem.
again, Sam.
Thanks so much.
Cool. So just to reiterate, business cards up here. You can also take one if you're interested in never presenting. This is open. Anyone has anything to say, so it doesn't have to be anything groundbreaking. If you just want to present your experiences developing with X or anything like that, just let me know. So my email's on there. You can drop me an email. Look out for the next one. Now that my child has been born, I probably will be a little bit more available. So I'll try and schedule these maybe a little bit more often. So just keep an eye out on the page. But I'll make sure to email you guys with the notes and stuff. Thanks again for coming.